Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast. This month on the show, we've been doing a mini-series covering the academic skills of note-making, research and writing. We're capping things off today with a look at one of my strongest pieces of advice for anyone with long-form written work to do, and that is to invest time in the planning. Today, I'm going to be covering three things. Firstly, why I think planning is so important, even and perhaps especially if your available writing time is limited. Secondly, a step-by-step process for how to plan if you're working on an assignment, dissertation, essay, or other written project. And finally, how to adapt that process if you're writing in an exam under test conditions. So let's start with the why. Why have I dedicated a whole episode to planning? Well, I want to take you back to episode 155 a few months back, where author Ollie Lovell introduced us to the concept of cognitive load theory, which says that our brain's ability to simultaneously process multiple ideas is limited. We can only hold on to so many ideas in our thinking mind, or working memory, as psychologists call it, simultaneously. Psychologists classically estimate the capacity of working memory at 7 plus or minus 2 items, whether that item is a word, a number, or other idea. And a copious ink has been spilled debating this finding of 7 plus or minus 2 units in your working memory, proposing alternatives. But what is not debated is that working memory capacity is limited, very limited compared to our long-term memory and what we can store for weeks, months, years in long-term memory. So what's all this got to do with why essay planning matters? Well, let's say you haven't done any plan at all. Just think for a moment about all the different elements that your brain has to juggle in working memory simultaneously as you're working on any given sentence. You have to be thinking about where you are in your overall structure, things you've already said, and what's to come next. You have to be thinking about how you're putting your current point across. And perhaps in exam situations, that includes recalling any necessary evidence, data, or quotations to support that point. You have to be thinking about making a sensibly structured paragraph and where you are in that paragraph structure. Perhaps you've even been taught a specific paragraph format, like point, evidence, explanation, link, and you need to remember where you are in that framework. And then finally, you need to be figuring out a sensible way of phrasing the specific clause you're writing right now, so it reads like a good English sentence or whatever language you happen to be writing in. It's a lot of ideas for your poor brain to be juggling all at once. And it could get even worse than that. There are various factors that could compound the challenge. Like if you've got a particularly large amount you want to say in your writing, so it's a particularly extensive piece of writing, or if you have to recall ideas from memory if you're an exam, that places additional strain on you. Or if you're writing in a second language and forming those good English sounding phrases, is that little bit harder work for you because you're writing in your non-native language. So the solution to all of this is to be diligent about how we approach our planning. When you plan well, you can focus solely on marshalling your ideas without the burden of structuring paragraphs and sentences. You can afford the luxury of non-linear thinking. That is to say, you can build out your thought process, your points out of sequence, adding ideas and additions and evidence to different sections of different parts of your argument as they occur to you. You might not necessarily think of all 10 relevant points under section 1 all at once. You might think of the first 7, and then another 3 will come to you later on as you're brainstorming ideas for other sections. That's the idea of your brain thinking non-linearly. You just can't do that if you're writing every sentence as it comes to you without a plan. Then when we've got a strong plan in place, when we come back to write up our sentences and paragraphs, we know exactly what we need to say next. As we work on each sentence, all we need to worry about is writing a good English sentence. We don't need to worry about what's come before, what's going to come after. You don't need to worry about the big structure. You know exactly what you want to say. You've already recalled any necessary information to back up your argument if you're in an exam situation and need to remember things. So the words can just flow and you can just focus on writing a good sentence. So when we plan well, we can unlock a range of benefits for ourselves. These include the following. So firstly, your writing will include a more comprehensive range of ideas and evidence points. You'll simply be able to think of more because your brain will be less crowded out by all the things that I was discussing earlier. When you do that plan, you can just focus solely on bringing as many good ideas and points to mind as possible and getting them down in your plan. In exam situations, when being able to remember things is important, your ability to recall things is improved. Because your working memory is a little clearer, you just have the edge on being able to remember that extra little detail that you might not have otherwise been able to remember if your working memory was crowded out and really, really busy by juggling everything in your brain all at once. Your writing will have a clearer structure at the macro level. It will be better organized and flow better because you can figure out a good approach, a good argument as part of the plan. Your writing will also have a better quality at the micro level. Those individual sentences will be more accurate, crisper in their syntax, because when you're writing them, all you're worrying about is writing a good sentence. You don't have to worry about remembering the point, what's come before, what's come after. Your plan has captured all of that. And finally, you may even find that you're quicker overall. People often are surprised that when you add the step of planning, particularly when you're kind of not used to this idea, you can actually end up producing more quality writing in less time. Now, that last one is a little counterintuitive. You may think that when one step becomes two, now it's planning, then writing, not just writing, it should take longer overall, but it doesn't. A good analogy is how an assembly line works. It's far faster to split up the process to manufacture a car if you work on each stage in turn at a dedicated station. One station adds the wheels, the next station fits the headlights, and so on. So planning sounds great, but how do we actually do it? There are lots of methods, but the one I favour for lengthy, complex written assignments, when I'm not in an exam situation, is the method I was taught way back when I was a student at Cambridge by my writing mentor at the time. So it's a pretty straightforward process. There are 2 steps to it, and if you have some post-it notes to hand, you can use those for this. Otherwise, you can simply cut up some paper into small little bits, and those will work just fine instead of post-it notes. So the first step is the thought dump. So grab your stack of post-it notes or equivalent and start writing your ideas down. 1 idea per post-it note. If you're feeling fancy, you could even use different colours of post-its for different themes. To start with, just start scribbling down what's on the top of your head. You'll probably find that you go fast at first as the ideas flood out, and then it starts to slow down a little bit as you've got all the easy stuff written down and you start digging into some of the less obvious stuff. So on a single post-it, you might, for instance, have a concept or an example or a case study or a relevant academic study or an opinion or a piece of commentary, whether that's one you've come up with or a piece of commentary or opinion from someone else. As you fill each post-it note in, attach it to a surface. If it's a moderate to large project, you might need A3 paper or even bigger, or simply use a floor or a wall. Don't worry too much about the structure at this stage. We'll have a chance to clean that up later. But you'll probably find that there are some groupings emerging, in which case feel free to start clustering related post-it notes together in groups by theme or whatever groupings make sense to you. As I say, don't fret too much about getting the grouping right for now. The main focus at this stage is just getting the ideas down. We'll have plenty of time in stage 2 to sort through the ideas and flesh that structure out properly. Once you've got down everything that comes from your head, you might want to cross-check any core notes or resources, such as if you're making notes on your research or readings, to make sure that there isn't anything you've missed. You might find there are a few extra post-it notes when you go back and check your notes. We can then move into step 2. Now we get to start moving stuff around and get it all organised. So if you haven't already started to group the post-its by theme, then now is the time. Which ideas belong together? Make clusters of post-its and refine your groupings. This gives us the basis of the structure of our writing. So maybe you end up with 5 clusters, 5 groups. Those would be the 5, depending on the scale of your writing, it could be the 5 paragraphs for an essay, or if you're writing a book, those could be the 5 chapters. You may decide some post-its don't fit your structure. You don't have to include everything. So you might have a separate section off to one side, which are for ideas that you're planning to discard. Things may move in and out of the discard pile as your structure emerges. And then you may also find that there are areas you've identified that feel a little undercharged or perhaps poorly evidenced. Maybe that's a prompt at some point to go back to your notes or even take on a little further reading to flesh out your argument in that little area where you feel you've got a little bit of a gap. Then finally, we decide on the order. Let's say we have 5 groups, 5 clusters of ideas. Decide which order you want to write them. add in the numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are our 5 paragraphs, or our 5 sections, or our 5 chapters. Now, if it's a big piece of writing and there's a lot of content in a particular cluster, you may need to go sort of double click on any given cluster and be a bit more granular about the structure within that cluster. So shuffle the post-its around some more within group 1 to come up with a sensible order to raise the specific points within group 1, section 1, if you need to. That's probably not necessary if it's a smaller scale piece of writing and group 1 is just 1 paragraph. But if it's a big piece of writing and group 1 represents, a whole chapter or a whole big section of a dissertation, you may need to do some further organization down at the level of kind of how you structure your thoughts within a particular group. Otherwise, that's it. We've got our plan. I'd suggest taking a photo at this point to make sure you've got a record of it all. And then the next step is writing. So dig out your laptop or old-fashioned pen and paper, however you're writing it up. And if I am typing, as opposed to handwriting, then the first thing I'd probably do is write in the section headings or the first sentence of each paragraph for each of my groupings, the 5 groupings that I've been using in this example. And then I simply go through and start filling out each section based on the points in my plan. Now, so that's all well and good, but what if I'm in an exam? I can't very well be getting out A3 paper and post-it notes. Well, no. But you can certainly practice this way while you're training for the exam and while you're building up your essay planning skills. And then once you're comfortable planning with the post-its, stop using them and switch to just writing the points directly onto the page. You lose the flexibility to move ideas around and shuffle them around. But if you trained your brain to kind of start thinking in terms of groupings and structure, you'll find you start to naturally group things quite well. You might want to lay your plan out like a spider diagram or maybe a tree diagram, such that you'll easily be able to add more ideas to different sections in a non-linear way as the thoughts come to you. Now, one other thought on the exam example, if we're doing a piece of writing in an exam, there's a general temptation, I think, to squeeze the planning time down. We want to get into the writing as quickly as possible. And I understand that because that feels like what you're being judged on. That feels like the actual answer, doesn't it? But my general advice is to do the opposite. Be much more generous than you think you should be when you're doing the planning. For most people, I think the stage when you're marshalling your ideas and structuring your argument, i.e. the planning phase, that's when the battle is won or lost. That's when you score the marks, far more so than when you actually write up the sentences and paragraphs. If you've got a really good plan with a really solid structure, really good set of points, then the sentences and paragraphs just kind of write themselves. And assuming you're reasonably competent at writing, then that's kind of going to be the easier bit of the process for you compared to when you are brainstorming and coming up with the points in the first place. So do be generous with the time you give to that all-important planning process. You might want to try 1/3 of your total time allowed for the question for writing your plan as a rough guideline. So for a 15-minute long answer question in an exam, try spending a full 5 of those 15 minutes doing the planning before you start writing up. At least 5 minutes, maybe even 6 or 7. For a 1 hour essay in an exam, try doing a full 20-minute plan before you spend the remaining 40 minutes writing up. You may be doing this already, but in my experience, this is significantly longer than most students I talk to are used to. So how do you know it's going to work for you? Try it out. Do the exam practice under timed conditions. See if you prefer using a longer planning time. See if it helps you produce higher quality answers in the limited time that's available. Most people do find that's the case and never look back. So that's a wrap for today. We touched on a little bit of exam strategy just now. So while we're talking about that, I should probably mention if you want more tips and tricks to help you improve your test-taking game, then there's lots more where that came from. I've got tips and strategies covering all kinds of exam formats, not just long-form writing. I have lots to say on multiple choice, for example, lots of interesting strategy on that. And I've recorded all of my favorite ideas in a little self-study course called Exam Success Secrets, which you can find at examstudyexpert.com/exam-secrets. And as with all of my self-study classes, it's available at no extra cost for Study Smarter Network members. Otherwise, that is a wrap for today. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode on planning and indeed enjoyed our little series on academic skills generally, as we've been covering over the last few weeks, touching on note-making, research, and as today, writing. It's been fun talking about some of these skills with you. We spent quite a bit of time talking about preparing for exams, how to learn well, So I thought it was quite nice to cover some of the academic skills that we use often throughout our course, throughout the year, leading up to exam season. And I hope you've enjoyed it and got some useful takeaways from the series. Coming up next week, I have another instalment of our ever-popular Student Stories series, looking at a rather interesting case of a student who's taking some very challenging entrance exams, requiring memorizing huge amounts of information, which is released 30 days ahead of the exam. It's quite an interesting case study on how optimizing different elements of your study and exam taking strategy, even if you've kind of got some of the basics in place, but taking those ideas to the next level can really kind of get you over the line in a very, very competitive exam process. And I think there's some broadly applicable takeaways for so many of us from this conversation and from the students' experiences. So I hope you'll be able to join me for that episode next week. For today, thank you so much, as always, for listening. Enjoy planning your writing and wishing you every success, as always, with your studies.
Just before you go, did you know you can hire William as your very own coach and mentor to show you the stress-free way to ace your exams by studying smarter, not harder? Find out how at exams.Expert.com/coaching.